Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Be Like Christ for another Bible study. Today we are talking about 1 Samuel 21. 1 Samuel chapter 21, free PDF, which you can download on our website at tobelikechrist.com. When did the events of this chapter happen on the biblical timeline and the world timeline? Well, they were probably placed somewhere between approximately 1015 BC to 1010 BC. Saul, who we're going to talk about in a second, he was the first king of Israel. He began his reign about 1050, so this is a good while after that. He's been king for a while. We must now discuss our main characters. First up, we'll talk about Saul. As I mentioned, he was the first king of Israel. He was originally from the tribe of Benjamin, and he really hated the second main character, and that was David. David had already been selected by God to be the second king of Israel and to replace Saul, but Saul really wanted him dead because he was jealous of him, and so David has been on the run. Then we have Ahimelech. Ahimelech is a new character in this chapter. He was a priest who served God at the tabernacle, which was in Nob at this point in history, N-O-B, Nob. Achish was the king of Gath. That was a Philistine city. And then finally we have Doeg. Boo. Doeg's not going to be a good guy. He's only mentioned for a short period in this chapter, but he'll come up again in the next chapter. He was an Edomite. He was the chief herdsman of Saul. And then we go to our map. David is going to spend time in Nob short time in Nob, and then he's going to go to Gath, which was a Philistine city. If you remember, Goliath was originally from Gath. Now, most archaeologists place Nob just to the northwest of Jerusalem, and many actually think that the two towns were in eyesight of one another, so very, very close. All right, now let's do our chapter breakdown, verses 1 through 9. We're going to talk about David, the holy bread, and the sword of Goliath. So after fleeing from Saul at the end of the last chapter, David went to Nob, or at least he made a pit stop at Nob, where the priests of God were working at the tabernacle, and he spoke to Ahimelech, who was one of the priests there, and he asked him if he had any bread for him and his men. Well, Ahimelech told him that he didn't have any common bread on hand that he could give to David quickly, but he did have holy bread. Now, what exactly is holy bread? Well, if you were with us for our Leviticus study and you have a really good memory, you may remember that holy bread, which is called the bread of the presence, was put into the tabernacle each Sabbath day, and then it was replaced on the next Sabbath day. So this bread was only supposed to be eaten by the priests, but Ahimelech had some on hand, and so he gave it to David. David also didn't have any weapons because he had to flee somewhat quickly. So he asked Ahimelech if he had any weapons there, and Ahimelech said, well, I only have one, and that's the sword of Goliath, which had been stored there at Nob. So David took the sword of Goliath. Unfortunately, though, the actions of Ahimelech were observed by somebody watching from the shadows. This guy named Doeg, he was not an Israelite, he was an Edomite. He was the chief herdsman of Saul, and that's going to come up in the next chapter. All right, so that takes us to section number 2, verses 10 through 15, and there's only 15 verses, so it's a short chapter. David continued running until he came to Gath, which, as I mentioned, was a Philistine city. The Philistines were like the sworn enemies of Israel. So David must have been pretty desperate, especially considering he was going to Gath with the sword of Goliath, who was from Gath, and the people in Gath recognized him. They recognized him as David, the one who the Israelites had sung about. Saul killed his thousands, but David killed his 10,000s. And many of the people that David would have killed would be Philistines. So David must have really been in a tight spot. He recognized that he was in a tricky situation, and he changed his behavior. He started to pretend like he was insane, like he was out of his mind. The text says, quote, he made, quote, marks on the doors of the gate and let his spittle run down his beard. So he legitimately just acted like he was crazy. Achish, the king of Gath, didn't view David as a threat because of this, and David, was able to hide out there without getting into any trouble. Now, finally, for our application, don't skip over small stories like these in the Old Testament, the one about like Ahimelech and David, because sometimes they're important to understanding what goes on in the New Testament. We may think that they're insignificant, like, this doesn't really play into the story that much, but Jesus actually references back to David's meeting with Ahimelech when he's talking to the Pharisees in Matthew chapter 12, verses 1 through 8. if you don't understand what happened at Nob in 1 Samuel 21, then you're going to have a hard time interpreting Jesus' words correctly. And there's a lot of little stories, little details in the Old Testament that we need to properly understand the New, right? So nothing is unimportant here.